Fantasy matchup time. Mike Tyson versus George Foreman. And this is George Foreman, both versions. So I'll do a breakdown for both. The George Foreman before his 10-year hiatus and then after his 10-year hiatus. I think that Mike Tyson against a prime George Foreman, I see Mike Tyson winning the fight. Let me just say that straight off the bat. George Foreman did very well against Joe Frazier. That's one particular style. Joe Frazier is a slow starter. Oh, he was a slow starter, RIP. He probably had better stamina than Tyson. In fact, he certainly had better stamina. And over a 12 or 15 round distance, he certainly had a better work rate than Mike Tyson. But he wasn't as dynamic. He didn't have as quick a feet as Tyson did. He wasn't able to create the angles. He wasn't as dangerous from long range as Mike Tyson was. And I say long range because Tyson was able to close the distance very, very quickly and land punches. So even though he had extremely short arms for a heavyweight, he was able to cut the distance against much taller fighters, get past their jab, and land, let's say, a straight right hand or a left hook from long range. Essentially, yeah, he would cover the ground quickly and then land a shot. So he was very different to Joe Frazier. Styles make fights. I'm not here to say that he was better or worse than Frazier. I'm just saying he could do certain things that Frazier couldn't do and vice versa. But the things that he could do that Frazier couldn't, I think they'd be crucial against young George Foreman. Foreman, as we know, never had a great defense. Foreman's strengths were always punching power, terrific physical strength. George Foreman always had both versions of Foreman. He was one of the physically strongest heavyweights ever. The guy was tremendously strong physically. Very few people, if anyone, in George Foreman's career was able to outmuscle him. In fact, I don't think anyone was ever able to outmuscle this guy. He was tremendously strong. And that was, I think, one of the things that people underestimate about George Foreman or don't mention that much is his actual physical strength. That's another thing about Lennox Lewis as well that people don't, boxing fans don't talk about as much as actual people who fought Lennox Lewis or people who sparred Lewis. Go listen to the testimony of people who sparred Lewis or fought him. And they say the guy's physical strength was absolutely ridiculous. Shannon Briggs said that. I think it was in an interview with, maybe it was Boxing Beats and Rhymes or Bayloric TV. I can't remember which it was. But even Briggs said that when he fought Lewis, he said it wasn't Lewis's punching power that really got to him. It was Lewis's physical strength. He couldn't believe it. He said when he got in a clinch, it was like it was a brick wall. He couldn't do anything with the guy. He was unbelievably strong. And everyone said that. All Lewis's opponents and sparring partners said this is the strongest guy they've ever been in the ring with. He was just unbelievable physical strength. And with George Foreman, I remember Emmanuel Stewart saying this. He said that, in his opinion, Lennox Lewis, George Foreman, and Sonny Liston were the three naturally strongest heavyweights of all time, just in terms of their physical strength in a clinch and their ability to move their opponent around and control their opponent physically. Those three guys were the naturally strongest heavyweights ever, in his opinion. And again, certainly Foreman, I would agree with one of them. I'm not sure about Liston, although he was very strong. I'm not sure he's as strong as some of the modern heavyweights like a Vladimir Klitschko or whatever. But that's neither here nor there. Foreman had tremendous physical strength. Also a tremendous jab. He had a great, great jab, a great uppercut, and he used the uppercut very effectively against Joe Frazier. But again, Joe Frazier is not able to cover the distance as quickly as a Tyson. He's not able to come in at different angles the way Tyson was. He didn't have the jab that Mike Tyson had. And I just feel that Tyson would catch George Foreman early in the fight. We saw Foreman. People might say that this was not a prime Foreman. I tend to disagree. But you saw Foreman against Ron Lyle hit the canvas fairly early in that fight, several times. I think he'd hit the canvas against Mike Tyson too. Ron Lyle, certainly a big puncher, but not as quick, not as explosive as Tyson. I think Tyson would have found Foreman's chin. And I actually believe this is against the grain, actually, for most people. I actually believe that Tyson would stop young George Foreman inside 5 rounds, 5 or 6 rounds. That's what I believe, just based on the styles. I think he'd stop him. I just don't think Foreman had the defense. It was too easy to hit. Foreman had a good chin, don't get it twisted. But when a guy's hitting you flush with shots you don't expect and don't see on a consistent basis, he's going to drop you. And we saw Foreman anyway get dropped by Ron Lyle, even when he wasn't tired. Yes, the Ali knockout defeat was more to do with fatigue than actually being hurt. But against Ron Lyle, he was legitimately hurt early in the fight and dropped heavily. And I think Tyson would do the same to him. Maybe Foreman might get stopped on his feet against a prime Tyson. And if the fight goes long, I mean, pick him. George Foreman's physical strength might come into play if he manages to survive the early rounds against Tyson and starts pushing him back and using his jab more. But that's how I would see it anyway. Now, against an old George Foreman, this might sound counterintuitive because old George Foreman really, on paper, shouldn't have been as good as a young George Foreman. But there were certain things I think that old George Foreman improved slightly. I think old George Foreman was more measured. He paced himself better. And he didn't have a spectacular defense or anything like that. But I think his defense was improved. He was more defensively aware, old George Foreman rather than young George Foreman. He was more defensively aware. He was using that cross-arm guard a lot more, blocking shots on his arms and shoulders and stuff like that. And I actually think that old George Foreman would have had a better chance, at least at going rounds with Tyson, than young George Foreman. I think he would have been able to use his size more effectively, his physical strength more effectively when he was older, because he was more strategic, took his time more, still had that great jab, slower, even slower than when he was young. But I just think the extra smarts that he gained as an older fighter would have come into play. And would he have survived the distance with Tyson? I doubt it. He was still a very stationary target, although he would have been pushing Tyson off and whatnot and trying to land a jab. But I don't know. Maybe he would have gone 9, 10 rounds, maybe get stopped late, maybe 9 rounds, stopped on his feet. And yeah, that's how I see it anyway. I see Tyson beating young George Foreman or old George Foreman and doing it probably by stoppage, with Foreman being stopped on his feet. And if either version of Foreman was going to go the distance, I would say the old George Foreman would be more likely to go the distance because he paced himself better. He was more defensively and strategically aware. And yeah, that's how I feel. So drop your comments below. I'm pretty sure most of you disagree with me because whenever I see this fantasy matchup on the internet anywhere, most people seem to be picking Foreman, but I would actually go with Tyson in that fight. But let me know how you feel. It's your boy Hatman. I'm out.